On today's show, the Caps are heading into the biggest offseason pivot of the Ovechkin era because right now this franchise is trying to plan for the future without even knowing if Ovechkin is coming back.
Your Locked On Capitals, your daily podcast on the Washington Capitals.
Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Well, hello, and welcome into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Dan Holmi, and today's episode, we're talking about the summer and the changes that could take place. We'll talk about Elias Pettersson, because the rumors connecting him to the Caps are not going away. And honestly, the fit makes a whole lot more sense than people want to admit. I'll break down the contract, the risk, Vancouver's front office changes, and whether this is actually something worth taking seriously. We'll then talk about the future of the Capitals and ultimately what Ovechkin plans on doing, because Spencer Carberry admitted this past week the Capitals are preparing for two completely different versions of next season, depending on what Ovechkin decides. But where we will start today is Vegas, and how that series between Vegas and Anaheim may have quietly changed this entire offseason for the Caps by knocking out Anaheim and officially locking in the Capitals into picks 16 and 18 in the first round of this summer's 2026 draft. So let's get into it. The Capitals have their draft ammo ready. That is the biggest takeaway here in segment one, is the Capitals have the flexibility to make a major move because two top 20 picks completely change what Chris Patrick can do this offseason. So starting with that, with Vegas in the series, because this mattered a lot to Capitals fans. So if you didn't have vested interest in watching Anaheim versus VGK, other than Dowd and Carlson, that was an exciting storyline. The Vegas Golden Knights eliminate the Anaheim Ducks in 6 games, and with that, the Caps officially lock in Anaheim's first-round pick at 18th overall. Had Anaheim moved on, well, that would have been lower. We're talking maybe a 20s pick. So this is huge for the Capitals. So now the Capitals head into the draft with picks 16 and 18 in the first round. And honestly, this is a huge deal for the organization. And why is that? Well, Chris Patrick has some real options. At the trade deadline, when the Caps moved John Carlson, there was, a lot of emotion tied up into that. And understandably, Carlson was a pillar on this team, goes back to the Stanley Cup run. Been here forever. And ultimately, a lot of fans hated the idea of moving him. But this is exactly, why teams make difficult decisions when they do. The Capitals looked big picture. They looked at the timeline of the roster and realized they needed flexibility more than nostalgia. And now, what have they done? They've turned that deal into a premium asset. And, here's the thing, getting picks 16 and 18, people hear, mid-first round picks, and sometimes people are like, who cares, Dan? Who cares? They're draft picks. Those picks are very valuable. Especially with what's going on in the NHL. Young players, right, on entry-level deals are incredibly important in a hard cap league. The first-round picks are the currency, the teams ask for when you want to make an impact. And the Capitals have a real opportunity to make this team either better immediately or in the mid to long term. And that's why this matters, because Chris Patrick has already told everyone that the Capitals want to improve the top 6, right? We want that top 6 forward that we've heard about for the last, 2 seasons or so. So if you want a legitimate top 6 forward, teams are going to ask for premium futures, right? And that's kind of the hard part. Right? Are you giving up 2 draft picks for immediate gratification, or are you taking both of those draft picks to build for the future, or maybe a mix of both? Now the Caps have real options. And what I, really like here is the flexibility because, like I said, you can keep both picks, trade one and keep one, package both in a bigger move, or use them separately in multiple deals. That's the position you want entering into a major offseason. And honestly, to me, for the first time in a while, the Caps don't feel trapped. And that's the biggest difference here. I would say, for a few years, this organization felt, stuck between eras, right? Are we all in on Ovi and Backstrom and Oshie, or are we all in on the future? And I think for the longest time, the Capitals winning the Cup in 2018, that was kind of out of left field. That, wow, we did it with this crew. How about if we kind of just build around this core? And they did that year after year after that, year. Too old to fully contend, too competitive to fully rebuild. And now suddenly you've got cap space, you've got prospects arriving, you've got premium picks, you've got roster flexibility. That's not a bad place at all for the Capitals to be in. I just want to know, is Chris Patrick the guy to facilitate a big move like this or moves? Especially if the front office is willing to be aggressive, something that we have not seen thus far. And the draft, coming up here feels like the point where the offseason could really explode. Once teams get on to, the draft floor, everything starts moving fast, right? Trade conversations escalate. Are you going to be willing to trade this pick for that pick? Are you going to trade to move up? Are you going to trade to move down? Prices change. Players suddenly become available. And, the Caps are going into that environment with real ammunition. This is the important part that I don't want to gloss over. They still need clarity from their captain, Alex Ovechkin, before they get there. Because if Ovi comes back, your approach changes, right? That we need to be all in on winning right now. Because best case scenario, what are we talking? A 1, 2, maybe at most 3-year deal? If Ovi comes back, you want to plan for immediate wins. If he leaves, your approach changes even more. And that's why these next, several weeks here feel massive for this team. The Carlson trade already looks better than it did when it first happened. There was some real, shock, I guess you could say, like, oh my God, 74's on the move. Not because, Carlson wasn't important to this franchise. He absolutely was. But, because the Caps recognized the timeline changing before things got worse. That is smart management, that you took an expiring contract for a player that is 36 years old and used that into moved it into draft capital with a trade with Anaheim. A lot of the organization, hangs on to veteran stars too long, right? We talked about the Penguins, and the Capitals were guilty of that for years because emotionally they don't want to move on. The Capitals finally made the difficult decision early enough to get real value back. Now we'll see how they use it. All right, to wrap up segment 1 here, the Caps head toward the draft with 2 top 20 picks, real cap flexibility, and a front office that finally has room to maneuver aggressively. Chris Patrick has the assets to make a significant move if he wants to. That is the big question. The question now is how aggressive the Capitals are willing to get. And coming up next, Spencer Carberry is preparing for two completely different futures, while the entire organization waits on the biggest question of the offseason from Alex Ovechkin. I'll discuss straight ahead right here. The hunt for the Stanley Cup is on, and now you can trade every game on Kelce. On Kelce, you can trade every single playoff game, every series, the conference finals, and the championship. Coming up here, we got a game coming up where it is Montreal versus Buffalo. Montreal is at 48%, Buffalo at 53%, with a potential payout of $189, meaning a $100 trade pays out. As the playoffs heat up, those numbers move in real time, and you can buy in or out at any time. On Kelce, you're trading against peers in a live market, meaning there's no house, and as the probabilities change, you can buy in and out of your position. For a limited time, download the Kelce app and use code LOCKEDON to get $10 when you trade 10. Kalshi, Kelce. Trade on anything. Workplace chaos, deadlines stacking up, inbox overflowing, and the one position you have to fill is still sitting open when the pressure's on and you need the right hire. This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs. Indeed Sponsored Jobs helps you reach the people who actually fit what you're looking for, skills, experience, location, so you're not just hoping the right candidate stumbles across your post. And here's a stat that really says it all. In the minute I've been talking to you, companies like yours made 27 hires on Indeed, according to Indeed Worldwide. So if you're hiring, spend less time searching and more time interviewing candidates who check all your boxes with Indeed Sponsored Jobs. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Less stress, less time, more results. When you need to cut through the chaos, this is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to help your job get the premium status it deserves at Indeed.com/podcast. Just go to Indeed.com/podcast right now and support our show by saying you heard about it on the Locked On Capitals podcast. Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs. Don't forget to check out the Everydayer Club for ad-free episodes and access to a group chat with me and other listeners of the show. Go to lockedoncapitals.supercast.com. There is also a link in the show notes. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it is your team every day. So everything revolves around Alex Ovechkin. We're waiting on you, Ovi. What is your move going to be? And it's hard because Alex Ovechkin made the statement that, if he comes back, he wants to come back to a competitive team. How does Chris Patrick pull that off between now and the draft? Is what is said that we want some answers coming out of the Ovi camp before we, make some decisions at the draft. So that's what we're talking about, waiting on Ovi in segment 2. Because the biggest takeaway here is the Caps cannot fully execute their offseason plans until Ovi decides whether he's coming back. Because his decision changes the identity of how this franchise goes forward. And, Austin Matthews said a similar thing, that he said before he commits to another season, he wants to see meaningful change in Toronto. The difference, of course, is Austin Matthews is under 2 more years of contract, while Alex Ovechkin will be an unrestricted free agent on July 1st. And that is the biggest story hanging over this organization right now. It's not the draft, free agency, not trade rumors, Alex Ovechkin. And Spencer Carberry is in a unique position and kind of by proxy via Chris Patrick and the Capitals, because as Chris Patrick has to plan for 2 different scenarios with or without Alex Ovechkin, same goes for Spencer Carberry. And Spencer Carberry was talking on the Fan Hockey Show, basically confirmed that this week when he admitted the coaching staff is preparing for 2 different scenarios next season. How do you do that? How do you plan for a Capitals team with or without Alex Ovechkin, an absolute fixture on this organization for 20 years? But his comments, that tells you everything. That the Capitals are building, 2 offseason plans simultaneously because they don't know if the greatest player in franchise history is coming back. And, let's set something straight here, that it's easy to say, hey, he's going to be a 41-year-old next year. Who cares? This is not a ceremonial player hanging around for nostalgia. Now, this is a stat that I think doesn't get played out enough. Ovechkin still led the NHL at 40 years old in power play ice time last year. So to say that Alex Ovechkin still has a big role in the NHL for the Capitals at 40, next season being 41, is an understatement. That matters because the Capitals' offensive structure still revolves around him, right? The power play still flows through the left circle. The penalty kill still overcommit toward him. And defenders, right, they still, panic, when he drifts to open ice like, oh, no, not the office again. And even now, Ovechkin creates, I guess what I would say, gravity, right? Gravity that changes the way opponents defend against the Capitals. The shot's coming from the left dot, and you still can't prepare for it. Okay, maybe the shot's not quite as lethal as it used to be, as the netminders are getting better. But if he leaves, the Capitals, is simply not replacing goals. They are rebuilding the entire thing, the entire offensive identity of this team. I think Spencer Carberry deserves a ton of credit here. He's giving Ovechkin space publicly while still preparing for every outcome privately. He's not pressuring him like, hey, Ovi, what are you doing? Okay, call me tomorrow. Hey, Ovi, did you make a decision yet? And that's leadership, right? That's what makes Spencer Carberry, the former Jack Adams winner, so great. No public pressure, no, emotional campaigning, no awkward, please come back, just kind of giving him his space. That is how a professional handles things, not like John Tortorella, if you know what I mean. But that's a topic for a different podcast. Just respect, right? That is what Spencer Carberry does. Because, this decision, if you ask me, is clearly bigger than a hockey decision for Ovechkin. This is his family. This is, do I want to put the work in at 41, 40 going into 41 years old? It's about legacy, motivation, and whether he still believes the Caps can compete in a meaningful way. And again, how is Chris Patrick going to do that? Did Alex Ovechkin set a bar so high that the Capitals cannot clear it? And one thing Carberry said that really stood out, he mentioned the youth movement energized Ovechkin over the last couple seasons, because these aren't kind of blasé milquetoast prospects. These are big names, and they contributed right out of the gate, and that makes complete sense. For years, the Caps looked old, slow, awkward, and stuck. Now, right, there was a boost of energy in the organization. Cole Hutson, his season wrapped at BU and exceeded my expectations. Scored a goal, albeit an empty netter, in his first game. Ilya Protas, again, a guy that we probably should have seen earlier in the season, was amazing. Injected excitement into the pipeline. Of course, Ryan Leonard and what he did. That the roster finally feels to me like it's moving forward, not kind of stuck, not trying to bring in snarled old vets around him as placeholders. Let's keep propping up that Rock the Red era. That we're finally turning the page. And that mattered a lot for Ovechkin because, competitive players don't want to finish their career in a hopeless situation. I think that ultimately that is why Ovi shot that shot across the bow of the Capitals saying, don't waste my time. I want to come back if we can be competitive. But here's the problem. Chris Patrick cannot wait until July 1st for clarity. The NHL Draft is June 26th. And the Capitals need to know exactly what kind of offseason to plan for. Because the strategy changes completely. If Ovi returns, right, the Capitals are likely looking for support pieces and another top six score to strengthen the current core. Likely, one of those first round draft picks will get burnt on that. Or what I fear, both of them. If Ovi leaves, well, then I think it goes in a completely different direction. You're planning for a new offensive centerpiece, right? A rebuild power play, a long-term identity piece. A headline addition capable of carrying the next era, right? And honestly, I don't think people fully understand how difficult replacing a guy like Ovechkin is. For almost, 2 decades here, 2 decades, right? The Caps have had ultimate, safety valve, right? That you need a goal, Ovi. We're lacking a momentum, put Ovi in there. Need a power play, Ovi. Ovi. And every opponent knew the puck was going and they couldn't stop it consistently. The kind of offensive, gravity is the buzzword I keep coming back to. Without him, the Capitals wouldn't just lose production, they would lose structure, they would lose identity. And what really stands out to me is how everyone around the organization is talking about this situation. Carefully, not panicked, respectfully, right? And this doesn't feel, like a previous contract negotiation. This feels like, to me, an organization approaching the end potentially of the end of a historic era. And whether the ending comes this summer or next summer, you can absolutely feel the weight of that right now. So Chris Patrick, the Capitals, they got to kind of plan either way. And I think the closer we get, you got to kind of plan that maybe he's not coming back, because I think if Ovi wants to do right by the Capitals, he's going to let them know, hey, guys, I'm going to be coming back, just so you know. Knock it out of the park at the draft. Knock it out on July 1st, and I'll come back. We can't wait until the draft on July 1st. We need answers. We need answers from Ovi. So to wrap up segment 2 here, the Caps are balancing, respect for the greatest player in franchise history with the urgency of preparing for the future. Spencer Carberry is handling it like a pro. Chris Patrick is waiting for clarity before making big moves, and everything this offseason still revolves around the biggest question: what does Ovechkin want to do next? And if the Caps do make a major move to prepare for the next era, there's one name that keeps coming out there: Elias Pettersson. Would he be a good fit? I'll discuss straight ahead right here. Missed calls and slow follow-ups are silent killers for businesses. That's how money gets left on the table without people even realizing it. That's why today's episode is brought to you by Quo, spelled Q-U-O, the business communication system built so you never miss a call. Quo helps businesses keep business conversations organized by letting your entire team manage calls and texts from one shared number. No more drop messages, missed opportunities, or disconnected communications. It's designed for how modern businesses actually operate. The part that I loved at my job: everything lives in one clean thread. Calls, texts, and voicemails. The whole team sees the conversation so nothing falls through the cracks, and their AI summaries save serious time by logging calls and highlighting the next steps automatically. Money is on the line. Always say hello with Quo. Try Quo for free, plus get 20% off your first 6 months when you go to quo.com/LockedOnNHL. That is QUO.com/LockedOnNHL. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. The best way that you can help grow the show is to subscribe to Locked On Capitals on YouTube, like the videos, and comment anything down below. So when we're talking about faces of the next era of the Capitals, those are big shoes to fill, and this summer I've brought up some big names. I've talked about Austin Matthews, I've talked about Tkachuk, I've talked about Robertson, some big names, but one name that continues to keep getting floated out there is Elias Pettersson. Now, and this all emanates from Elliot Friedman, of course. He's the guy that stirs the drink in this department. And I want to weigh in on my thoughts here, because the Capitals, if they get Elias Pettersson, they're looking for an upgrade at the center position. And, if you're a person that follows the NHL at large, you look at his numbers and go, hey, down year, right? Third line center to end the season. That, traditionally this is a guy that's a first line center. If he's struggling, maybe a second or third. So what gives? Well, what gives is, the Vancouver Canucks were the worst team in the NHL last season. And, you got to factor that in when we talk about a player having a down season. So that's the big takeaway right out of the gate here, the Pettersson gamble. If the Caps want to stay competitive beyond the Ovechkin era, then pursuing a player like Elias Pettersson is exactly the kind of high upside gamble the Capitals should at least investigate. So the reason this rumor keeps surfacing is simple. I think the fit makes a lot of sense. The Caps need elite offensive talent. And, the Canucks are entering a new organizational era. If you don't know, the Sedin brothers are back in their presidents of hockey ops, I believe. Two pillars on the Canucks for years, now in the leadership role. And Pettersson remains one of the few potentially available star-level centers in hockey right now. And that combination, obviously leads to speculation. Again, Friedge stirring the drink, and Vancouver's situation is what makes this especially interesting. Because the Canucks didn't just tweak the front office, they reset it. They need a change out west there, right? That it was a big step back for them. New management, new leadership, new expectations. That means moving out players to get young talent to help turn this thing around. And whenever organizations go through that kind of transition, every major contract gets evaluated, especially one as massive as Elias Pettersson. Because 2 years ago, this guy looked like a franchise cornerstone, after putting up 89 points. And when you take a look at his points, we talk about the 89 points, but in that was in the 23-24 season. In the 22-23 season, in 80 games, 102 points, 39 goals, 63 assists, major. So what everyone wants to point to is the 25-26 season with, 15 goals and 36 points, 24 season, 15 goals, 30 points. But, assists. So what is important to understand here, again, is that it is a Vancouver team that took a step back. So that is important to have that contextual information. And so you take a look at it, the production dipped dramatically. Now Vancouver, right, they have to decide whether those struggles are temporary or permanent. And, honestly, this is another case for Spencer Carberry trying to get the most out of a player, because the Caps already watched him do that with who? Pierre-Luc Dubois. After PLD had a big stumble with the Kings, he found a way to thrive the following season. Carberry has shown he can rebuild confidence and structure around talented players. That matters, because Pettersson still clearly has elite tools. The skating is there. The vision is there. The creativity is there. When we take a look at this guy, like I talked about, high water mark for him, 22-23, 102 points, and, a guy that put up 39 goals that season. This is a guy, if you want a bit of a history, 5th overall, first round, 2017. So, a guy that has some good upside. Guys don't get drafted that high if they're nothing but a garbage heap. And, this doesn't look like a player who suddenly forgot how to play hockey, right? I think just a victim of playing on a poor team. It looks like a player whose confidence and environment collapsed around him. And that's a very different conversation. So there's truth in statistics if you read into them. You got to look at where the team finished, how the team played. Now, obviously, the elephant in the room is the contract is scary. $11.6 million per year. This becomes a franchise-defining gamble. If Pettersson rebounds into, an elite top-line center again, the deal suddenly looks a lot better as the cap rises. If he stays a 50-point player, though, that contract becomes, a massive problem, I guess I'm going to say. That's the evaluation the Caps would have to make. Do they believe, the elite version of Pettersson is still out there, the 100-plus points? Because if they do, right, this is exactly the kind of aggressive move teams make during these transitional periods. Now, at the same time, this would not be an easy trade to complete. As a lot of guys of this caliber, Pettersson controls the process with a full no movement clause. You got to think that a guy like him wants to be anywhere else but Vancouver at this point. And Vancouver, this is the hard part, reportedly wants a center in return, and the return is rumored to be potentially a player like Pierre-Luc Dubois, a center for a center, right? You'd move a big contract off the books. You'd bring in a guy like Elias Pettersson. That's what's being floated out there. I don't necessarily love it, but, Vancouver's not going to offload Elias Pettersson just for, a Hendrix Lapierre and a, fourth line AHL player, right? They're going to want a real return and probably going to want a center. So that's what we're looking at. Those are the real obstacle. That's why this feels more like a situation to me than the Caps are monitoring closely instead of something immediately approaching the finish line. This is not a hasty decision to make. But if this thing gains momentum, the draft is where everything could accelerate like that, adding fuel to the fire. And that's why these picks 16 and 18 I keep circling back to, they matter. There's a lot of gravity there. Those selections give the Capitals enough flexibility to, be in a legit conversation involving a star-level talent. Again, I want you to erase, his stats, Elias Pettersson stats of last season. Okay, again, Vancouver has been in a downward trend here for a bit here. If you want to judge it, I would say judge it, kind of in between the high water mark and what we saw last year and hope it levels out a little bit there. But, as far as those picks, 16 and 18, without those picks, the Capitals probably, aren't even having that conversation. That's where we're at. Would that be a good upgrade for this team? Absolutely. Would they be willing to give up a player of pure Luc Dubois' status? If you're asking me, I would not make that trade. I want an upgrade, but moving out pure Luc Dubois to move in Elias Pettersson, again, you could look at the high water mark and go, are you kidding, Dan? Do you see all the points he put up? Just understanding that pure Luc Dubois put up, record numbers not too long ago, that the truth, as they say, lies somewhere in the middle. All right, to wrap up segment 3 here, Elias Pettersson represents exactly the kind of high risk, high reward player the Caps eventually need to pursue as they transition to the post-Ovechkin era. The talent, right, is undeniable. The contract is kind of dangerous. The fit is, well, let's just call it intriguing. And whether anything actually develops on how aggressively Vancouver's new front office wants to reshape its future. So to wrap up the show here, the Caps head toward the draft with picks 16 and 18 with cap flexibility and a front office that boasts a fat wallet and ready to get aggressive. Spencer Carberry is preparing for the post-Ovechkin era, or maybe if Ovechkin comes back. And out west, Elias Pettersson remains one of the most fascinating names to watch as this offseason starts to heat up. The next few weeks are going to define the next era of Capitals hockey. All right, once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, your only daily year-round podcast covering the Capitals. And I want to thank all of you that listen on the audio side and watch this on YouTube. You, as a matter of fact, are what makes this show successful. And if you're one of those that never miss an episode, let me tell you something. The Everydayer Club is built just for you. Get ad-free episodes 5 days a week for $5 a month. Oh, but there's more. Access to the members-only Discord access. Head to LockedOnCapitals.supercast.com. There is also a link in the show notes. For those of you on the video side, we send you to the first ever 24/7 national Locked On Podcast Network YouTube channel. On audio, make sure and make your second listen NHL Game Night on Locked On NHL. All right, once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it is your team every day. My name is Dan Holmi, and I'll talk to you again next time.